All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Kindred Skols. My name is Matt Freese. I'm here with my co-host, Nick Olson. Greg, busy workday. Obviously, we're kind of doing a quick reaction pod here. It seems like the announcement has been not official because he's obviously still coaching for the Rams, but pretty clear that Kevin O'Connell is going to be the next head coach of the Minnesota Vikings. This comes after a day where Vikings Twitter went wild, made a weird picture of Jim Harbaugh, everybody's profile picture, and was convinced themselves that Jim Harbaugh was going to be the next coach of the Vikings. So it is a little bit of a interesting turn there. Obviously, the Vikings had Harbaugh in the facility yesterday, 9-hour interview, and at some point it seems like they decided not to offer him the job, and it was kind of mutually decided that they weren't a fit for each other. So that turns us to Kevin O'Connell, who, in the same report, want to credit Chad Graff from The Athletic, who had a pretty good breakdown of the Harbaugh situation, said Kevin O'Connell blew them away when they interviewed with him on Monday. So, and I don't think this was the Vikings were expecting to hire Jim Harbaugh when he got into the building situation, right? It was, we wanted to make sure that Jim Harbaugh was the right answer. And I think that ultimately they determined they liked Kevin O'Connell more than Jim Connor for the next head coaching position. That's how we're here. Not that Jim Harbaugh turned them away or that, something, well, it was more something Jim Harbaugh in the interview turned them off than, this is a consolation prize for them, I think. I don't think they view it that way.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's been reported both from the Michigan beat and from our Minnesota Vikings beat that the Vikings never gave Harbaugh an offer, that he... when he called Michigan to say he was coming back, it was because the Vikings didn't give him an offer. John Bacon, who's kind of the gold standard of beat reporters for Jim Harbaugh and for Michigan, said if he had received an offer, he would have accepted it. So it's a shocker because how do you say no to a guy who's turned around every college program he's ever gone to and turned around the 49ers, took them to 3 championship games in 4 years? He's got an incredible resume. So pretty disappointing and surprising that the Vikings would choose to bring him in for a 9-hour interview, have all this sort of hype and momentum leading towards him being brought in, and then ultimately decide the McVay clone is the right guy. But from Chad Graff's reporting at The Athletic, it really does seem like O'Connell was kind of the favorite all along. Mm-hmm. And that was the report that O'Connell really knew the roster, had really done his due diligence, gave a very comprehensive report of Kirk Cousins, his strengths, his weaknesses, what to do with him, was able to do that for the entire roster. And the quote from one source there was, he just blew everyone away. So he really came out of that interview, both the first interview without Kwesi Adofo-Mensah before he had been hired, and then after Kwesi Adofo-Mensah met them in person in LA, everybody was really, really impressed. So despite a lot of reporting that Harbaugh really wanted this job, he really wanted to come back to the NFL, it seemed like O'Connell was really the favorite all along. And then when Harbaugh came in, it was really let's see if you can earn this job, because we understand the argument, but we also have a lot of people here who have already kind of made up their mind on O'Connell. So can you change their minds? And ultimately, Harbaugh was not able to. So it's kind of a dramatic turn of events. Really seemed like it was heading towards Harbaugh. It's hard to evaluate a head coaching hire, especially someone like O'Connell, where there's so much we don't know about him yet. I kind of liken it to when you're in the draft and there's this highly hyped prospect that everybody thinks you're going to take, and then you end up passing on him for somebody a little bit lower on everybody's boards, and you're sort of that's a surprise. Yeah. It's hard to judge those situations because clearly in those situations the team knows something that you don't. Whether it's with the draft prospect, maybe their character just didn't record didn't check out, maybe their medicals didn't check out. Obviously, there's plenty of red flags with Jim Harbaugh. So it's at the same time though you're reaching for somebody who is consensus worse off.
Yeah,
Jim Harbaugh was one of the best coaches in football in the last decade or two. Kevin O'Connell, these McVay guys have a good track record. The Zach Taylor's coaching in a Super Bowl not this weekend, but the next weekend. And, Matt LaFleur has the highest win percentage of any coach with 3 years in NFL history. So clearly there's a good track record there. But at the same time, though, we just don't know. It's hard to judge something like this. So
yeah, it's hard to judge what you don't know on guys. And I think the thing you pointed out there that I just want to hammer a little bit on this, because we're not hiring Jim Harbaugh, right? I think it's a bit of a disappointment, but I think if you look at the situation, like, the red flags were a big question for me in the whole scenario. And to peel back the curtain a little bit here, we were expecting Harbaugh to be the hire. Like, we kind of planned yesterday to do a show with Harbaugh as the hire, and as we were starting that show, it was reported that he was going back to Michigan, right? So we were already talking about Harbaugh a little bit. And for me personally, I think I had a little bit more trepidation than you and Greg did on the potential Harbaugh hire because of how it ended in San Francisco, right? His willingness to work with people and the way the Vikings in the process talked about having a leader who collaborated and somebody with the players who was a good communicator and all of that stuff. And Jim Harbaugh is kind of a weird dude, right? Like, he's not a normal person. So, you know, maybe, and this is all pure speculation, right? But maybe that sort of shone through in the interview as time wore on in the interview, and the initial kind of shine of his presentation of what was going on wore off. And, you know, they ended up with a conclusion that they still preferred O'Connell. So, you know, at the end of the day, Jim Harbaugh's not the head coach of the Minnesota Vikings. Kevin O'Connell will be, all reporting points too. So obviously, again, he can't officially be hired until after the Super Bowl. So, you know, just to give you a little bit of background, I guess, on Kevin O'Connell, right? His biography, drafted in 2008 by the New England Patriots, as a quarterback. He went to San Diego State, I believe, bounced around the league for a few years. Other team, he just had that 1 year with the Patriots. Other teams he played for were the Jets, the Dolphins, and the Lions, and also the San Diego Chargers at the time. He had a few years of a lull, where he was out. So the San Diego Chargers, he was on their preseason roster or practice squad or whatever in 2012. And then in 2015, he resurfaced with the Cleveland Browns. 2016, he was with the Chip Kelly San Francisco 49ers. And then 2017 through 2019, he was under Jay Gruden in Washington. Before finally, obviously, the last 2 years under McVay in Los Angeles. This was the first time he'd worked with McVay. McVay was the offensive coordinator in Washington up until 2016, I believe, but obviously he got hired away before Kevin O'Connell got there. O'Connell did spend 1 year with Kirk, right? 2017 Washington, he was that singular year with Kirk in Washington. So outside of that, like, I rattled off the teams, right? But it is actually a pretty diverse offensive background if you look at it until the last few Gruden McVay years. Obviously Chip Kelly was quite the change for that 2016 year. Like, that's a pretty different and innovative, obviously pretty collegey. And he also worked with Kwesi Adofo-Mensah on that squad as well, right? On that front office, I guess. He was kind of his role was like special projects or something, right? He wasn't directly a coach. Obviously came up, McDaniels, Bill O'Brien, Patriots under Bill Belichick. And that is kind of interesting to me because that was really the start of the like spread, hurry up offense, like the Earhart Perkins kind of one word play calls. The Patriots can go whatever tempo that they want on that offense. Like, that was the very beginning stages of that. So he's kind of gotten exposure to that, which I thought was a really unique and really progressive offense for the NFL at the time. And then he was under Brian like, he spent the most of the time in New York, the Rex Ryan Jets, where they went to 2 championship games. But Brian Schottenheimer was the offensive coordinator in those roles, and he is an Air Coryell guy, right? So he's got experience in Air Coryell offenses. He's got experience in the Patriots system, and he's got a lot of experience in the McVay, Shanahan, wide zone, West Coast roots offense as well. So it's a pretty diverse background there, which I think is interesting. And, you know, like Kevin Stefanski, when he was with the team, he can probably pull a lot from that while he might major in the wide zone stuff. So I don't know if you have thoughts on the background there, Nick.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting that I think he teamed up with Turner as well, or was it Bill Callahan who was kind of an Air Coryell guy?
The Chargers were Norv Turner when he was there. So, yeah, Turner was the coach of the head coach of the Chargers when he was there.
So, and to not just that, but the Earhart Perkins, the West Coast, the Shanahan, the Jay Gruden stuff, but also being able to pull in the Chip Kelly spread stuff too. Like, he's basically, it's rare you see somebody who's literally coached or been a quarterback in pretty much every NFL offensive system there is out there.
So, yeah, it is kind of interesting. And to clarify on Bill Callahan, he was with Bill Callahan. Callahan was the offensive line coach on both the Jets while he was there and Washington while he was in Washington, before he obviously got hired by Kevin Stefanski in Cleveland.
Yeah, and that kind of gets me into talking about Bill Callahan, gets me into, I think, what got me the most excited about Jim Harbaugh was not necessarily Jim Harbaugh himself. I think he's a brilliant offensive mind in his own right, but I think the most exciting thing about Jim Harbaugh was he has consistently built some of the most impressive staffs anywhere he goes. With the 49ers, he had Vic Fangio. He had lots of other guys who've gone on to do great things. Jim Tomsula, both they kind of had a falling out, was one of the best defensive line coaches. So he's just built that Michigan staff. He just had his defensive coordinator hired out to the Ravens. He's built out like really, really impressive staffs everywhere he goes.
Yep.
And so that was one of the most exciting things about it's not just Jim Harbaugh, it's Jim Harbaugh plus potentially, plus
Vic
Jim
Fangio
Harbaugh,
and those offensive lines.
Yeah, and the offensive line coaches that he would bring, he could like fix all our problems. So
yes.
When you get to Kevin O'Connell, it's obviously a much murkier situation about what kind of coaches he's going to bring in. And I think that's kind of it's hard to judge fully the Kevin O'Connell hire in a vacuum. I'll have a lot better idea about how I feel about it once I know who the defensive coordinator is going to be, who the offensive line coach is going to be. Are they going to keep Rauscher or are they going to move on? We mentioned Bill Callahan because he has a connection to Bill Callahan. Obviously, Bill Callahan is arguably the best offensive line coach in the NFL, has turned around the Browns' offensive line. I think he's still under contract, and he's the assistant head coach with the Browns, so I'm not sure they would allow him to be poached. But if not him, there's Aaron Kromer, who did a really great job with the Rams in 2020 as their offensive line coach and run game coordinator. He's a free agent right now. I'm kind of actually shocked that the Rams walked away from him, so would be cool to bring him in. And there's a few other guys you could go with there. And then I think the defensive coordinator hire is the most important thing because, the offense needs a facelift. They need to adjust the scheme. They need to do a better job not, stalling so frequently as they did under Clint Kubiak, who I think that was Kubiak's biggest problem was that, they weren't able to keep drives alive. So that's the most important thing. But the second most important thing and the biggest challenge, I think, from a roster construction standpoint is the defense. They have a lot of good players on defense, but they're all aging. And they're not all going to be healthy. And so you need to figure out a way to scheme around, not having any cornerbacks on the roster other than Cam Dance on Harrison Hand. You need to figure out what you're going to do with, DJ Wallen being your DE2 right now. So I think that's the most important hire. And we've seen currently some rumblings just now as we record that Wade Phillips has taken a sudden interest. His Wade Phillips' son Wes, I think, is on the Rams staff right now. So there's a connection there to Wade Phillips. Obviously, when McVay started out, it was Wade Phillips who was his initial defensive coordinator. So there's connections there. They could bring in Wade Phillips. I'm not sure if the Vikings are ready to run sort of like the cover one Wade Phillips scheme, but they would need to make some investments in some cornerbacks. But there's a lot of other guys. I think who is it? Ejiro. On the Rams.
Ejiro Evero, he got hired by the Broncos, I think. So
yeah, he's rumored to go to the Broncos right now. But Chad Graff reported Ed Donatel, who's like Ed Donatel was Vic Fangio's kind of like lieutenant for most of his time, is also a potential hire. Ed Donatel is currently was the Broncos defensive coordinator before they fired Vic Fangio. So it'll probably be somebody in that Fangio Staley tree because that's kind of where where O'Connell came up, but it's going to be very important that they nail that defensive coordinator hire because I don't think this team is going to be very good unless they get a very good defensive coordinator. And obviously, since we're not getting Mike Zimmer and we're probably not getting Vic Fangio, like that's now probably a pipe dream. It's probably going to be a downgrade in defensive scheme, but there's still a lot of good names out there. So I think it'll be really interesting to see who he poaches from the Rams. I know you were looking at this, Matt. Is there anybody else who pops out at you as people he could poach?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously, I'm kind of set on Vic Fangio or Vic Fangio for a coordinator. Wes Phillips, the Wade Phillips connection there is very interesting to me, right? I know I'm friends with a couple of Rams fans, and obviously they have no connections or anything either, but their expectation, I guess, is that O'Connell would take Wes Phillips with him, and Wes Phillips is kind of the next guy in line for that offensive coordinator role there. So if he does take Wes Phillips with him, I think that gives us a very good shot with Wade. We know Wade wants to get back in the NFL to be a coach. Like, he was not happy to be let go by the Rams, and he kind of wants to get back into the NFL. Like, he's said that publicly multiple times. So, if that's something that he's interested in, and it's something that O'Connell's interested in bringing in and stabilizing a defense, that'd be awesome, I think. Fangio or a Fangio tree guy, I think, would be my next option. And obviously with the Brandon Staley wanted to bring Kevin O'Connell with him to San Diego, or to Los Angeles, right, for the Chargers. Well, I guess across town, or literally in the same stadium, to the Chargers. But, and McVay blocked that on O'Connell's end. So, obviously, if Staley thinks highly of him, he has the connections with Fangio. He worked with Fangio for the year with Donatello, and he can speak highly of O'Connell to them and kind of facilitate that happening, right? It's all who you know in this business, right? In terms of who people want to work with and all that sort of stuff. So, at the end of the day, I think we've got a pretty good baseline, or O'Connell has a pretty good baseline for that defensive side where we can get somebody exciting in there. But obviously it's incredibly important to me. I put on Twitter yesterday, a few weeks ago, where I went on a rant saying, these are the guys I want at defensive coordinator and offensive line coach. And because of that reason, I would like to hire Jim Harbaugh, right? You hit on that earlier. So it's really important to me that we get those coordinator hires right. Definitely agree with that. And on the offensive side of the ball, the Bill Callahan connection, I would love if that happens, but I just hope we can bring somebody who can bring competent offensive line play to this team. Aaron Cromer, I think I would love to if O'Connell has a good relationship with him, because that's something that we've really, really struggled with for, going on 10 years now. So.
Yeah. And they have guys that they can, if you got a good offensive line coach, there are guys you can mold in the building already. Mm-hmm. They have Wyatt Davis, who obviously, came in out of shape and was never really ready, but you get him a good coach and he can be an NFL starter. He was, he was drafted with the expectation that he would be, and that he had that potential. You got guys like Oli Udoh, who have already shown significant improvement from where they were coming out of college. And if you can continue that trajectory, could become good starters. You have lots of other young guys in there. And then, of course, all the guys they already have starting on the line are highly drafted, highly athletic, high potential guys with the upside. So if they can just get those guys with a good coach, I feel like there really is potential for the offensive line to improve. They just need to find the right guy who can unlock that potential out of all of them. There's a few other guys they could probably poach out of the Rams. I think Eric Henderson makes a lot of sense. He's Evero's the pass game coordinator with the Rams, the defensive pass game coordinator.
Sure. And
Eric Henderson is the defensive run game coordinator for the Rams, in addition to being the defensive line coach. So I kind of think of them as the lieutenants under Raheem Morris right now as on the DC, since they're kind of the coordinators. Yep. So that would make a lot of sense. It was interesting seeing the Vikings let some of their assistant coaches go today. Like they let they let the QB's coach Andrew Janocko go, who was very highly regarded in the building, kind of thought of as like on the next Kevin Stefanski role. Had survived a lot of coaching overturns and had been able to coach a lot of different positions, and was thought maybe if Clint Kubiak were ever poached, he could be like next in line as the offensive coordinator job, and instead he's now going to a divisional rival. So you wonder maybe like they bring in Zach Robinson from the Rams or somebody, or maybe they bring in somebody else. I think there's a lot of different ways they could go with the coaching staff. It'll be very interesting to see how all that shakes out, because I do think, I see positives with Kevin O'Connell, particularly in, I think he'll be able to scheme up a good offense. That's kind of what you're bringing him in here for. That's why he was Brandon Staley's number one choice for offensive coordinator. And that's why McVay blocked him from going to Brandon Staley, because McVay knew how valuable he was. And McVay was probably right to do that, because now he's going to be the offensive coordinator of a Super Bowl team. So there's certainly there's certainly positives from Kevin O'Connell hire, but you just have so many questions with somebody so young, such a hot riser, how he's going to handle being a head coach as opposed to just the offensive coach. I don't know. Where do you stand on like the pros and cons of the Kevin O'Connell hire? How do you feel about it?
Yeah, I think if you go back to the initial part of this hiring cycle, right, and you asked most Vikings fans what they wanted in terms of their next head coach, right, they would say the young offensive mind or like the offensive guru who can develop a quarterback, right, into something good. And at the initial outset of this, that was probably like Kellen Moore and Brian Dable, right? And those were kind of the two guys people had honed in on. And then the team kind of seemed to go away from that, right? The Kellen Moore interview didn't seem to catch much steam. They didn't even interview Brian Dable. I mean, you had talked about Josh McDaniels, right? That's another offensive schemer and play caller. And it kind of seemed like we were heading more towards the defensive, the players coach on defense, where it's like a Mike Vrabel or a Mike Tomlin, where they're a leader and a community. So 3, 2, 1. A little bit of an interruption there, but as I was saying, it kind of was looking like the D'Amico Ryans, the Raheem Morris, and we got excited about that. And then all of a sudden it becomes Jim Harbaugh and it's this huge hype train, right? And then you look at Kevin O'Connell and you're kind of let down. But if you think about it, he was kind of the guy that we were, almost searching for at the beginning of the process, right? That young offensive minded head coach. So I think if you take a step back and you try to remove yourself from the emotions that you went through on the Jim Harbaugh cycle and all that sort of stuff, like this is a pretty solid hire, and he's very well regarded, right, as that offensive mind. Somebody back when he was with the Browns called him Tall McVay or something like that, which I think is hilarious. He's going to be the second youngest head coach in the NFL. Only Sean McVay is younger, which is crazy to think that Sean McVay is the youngest head coach in the NFL. And it feels like he has been a head coach for like half a decade now. Right. So that's a little bit weird, but, he's played in the NFL before. So you are going to have a little bit of like, this guy knows what it takes to be an NFL player. And I think that's a little bit overrated when it comes to this stuff, but I think players also respect that, right? And that helps him earn the respect of the locker room, despite the fact that he, doesn't have a whole lot of a storied history of NFL success as a coach, right? So I think that gives him a little bit of a step up. Another thing that's very interesting with Kevin O'Connell, right, is we have a huge quarterback question this offseason with what to do with Kirk Cousins. And O'Connell is intimately familiar with Kirk Cousins, having worked with him for a year in Washington, having worked under Sean McVay, who obviously coached Kirk Cousins as well, having apparently thought about trading for Kirk Cousins with the Rams last year. You got reports coming out that they considered that. Now the reporting is pretty interesting around that. That might lead you to believe that O'Connell wants Kirk Cousins. There are people saying it actually means he doesn't want Kirk Cousins, like Cousins is somebody he would be out on. And this might lead to a Vikings trade of him. So I think it's a really interesting question, right? And that's the biggest question of the Vikings offseason, and maybe the biggest question of it's going to define our next head coach's tenure, right? Like coaches and GMs are defined by the success of the team, and that's almost always defined by the quarterback play, right? So it'll be really interesting to see what we do with Kirk. I've been on record here saying I would prefer that the Vikings trade him and try to develop somebody younger, get somebody younger. I think you're a little bit on the fence about that, or you're more in Kirk's camp. Do you have thoughts on what Kevin O'Connell means for Kirk Cousins in particular?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm sure he has a very detailed plan of what to do. I'm sure that was the first question, or one of the first questions they asked every single candidate when they first interviewed, and probably in more detail in their second interviews, is what do we do with Kirk Cousins? Because that's the most pressing question for the franchise right now. I don't think it's like it's just a dichotomy. It's not a binary decision. It's not, do you like Kirk or don't you like Kirk? It's, what does an extension look like, and what are the potential trade offers you get? I don't think you let Kirk Cousins play out his contract, because you're not even really getting a comp pick in that scenario, because he's a 10-year vested veteran. I think the most you would get is a 5th-year compensatory pick, but that's not, the end of the 5th round is nothing. So I think the decision is really, do you trade Kirk, and if so, for what's your do you trade him for peanuts, or do you trade him for a second rounder? Do you demand a first rounder? Like, what's your asking price? And the other piece of the puzzle is, what does an extension look like? Does Cousins demand $45 million a year? That's pretty hard to stomach. If Cousins is like, I'll take, $35 million or whatever, that's probably a little more palatable. But QB salaries continue to go up and up and up. So I think, Where I stand with Kirk Cousins is he's a good, not great quarterback who has continued to improve during his tenure in Minnesota. He's gotten better at the things that he used to be the worst at. His pocket presence, I think, has improved substantially since his time in Washington. His ability to make plays out of structure is still below average, but it's no longer like zero. So I feel like we've seen him become a better quarterback. He's still a very accurate quarterback. He's still a very, very fast processor. With the retirements of the Phillip Rivers, the Drew Brees, the Tom Brady's now, he really is, I think, the best picture of what an elite pocket processor, accurate pocket passer looks like in the NFL right now. Obviously, he doesn't have the biggest arm in the NFL. He's probably below average just because every year more and more great arms come into the NFL. So, he's not Trevor Lawrence. He's not Derek Carr. He's definitely not Matthew Stafford or Patrick Mahomes or Aaron Rodgers. So, his arm strength is fine, but it's not good. So he has limitations, and then, he's not an athlete either. So he's a pure pocket passer. If he sees green grass, he's able to pick up a first down the same way that like pretty much anyone other than like the Matt Ryans of the world are. But he's still got limitations. So all that package, I think, goes into what kind of quarterback do you want for your roster right now? And I feel like Kirk Cousins right now is a quarterback that, like Matthew Stafford, you can go to a Super Bowl with Kirk Cousins if the team around him is ready to contend. I don't think this Vikings roster is ready to contend. I don't think they're on the cusp of being ready to contend either. I think the defense, the cupboard is pretty bare at the defense, and while I do think they have great skilled players around Kirk Cousins on the offensive line still is a major question mark. So I just don't think this is a roster ready to sign Kirk Cousins. I don't think it was a mistake to sign him in 2018 because I do think Kirk Cousins is the kind of quarterback that if you feel you're a quarterback away, Kirk Cousins can win a ring for you. I sincerely believe that, even despite all his limitations. I feel like Kirk Cousins probably makes the most sense on another roster right now. I think Kirk Cousins on the Browns makes more sense than Kirk Cousins on the Vikings. I think Kirk Cousins on the Buccaneers. The Buccaneers still have a very, very good roster. Makes more sense than Kirk Cousins on the Vikings. So on the Broncos have tons of young, upcoming pieces. George Payton is a big Kirk Cousins fan. He was one of the big reasons the Vikings went out and signed Kirk Cousins in 2018. There are those teams that all make sense. And with the Tom Brady's retiring, with a weak quarterback class, and with the success of the Matthew Stafford trade setting precedents, I do think there are going to be big bidders for the Vikings this year. It's going to be a seller's market if you have a Kirk Cousins, because look at the NFC right now. There aren't many quarterbacks better than Kirk Cousins. Kirk Cousins may have limitations, but there's you can argue Stafford, there's Russell Wilson, there's Kyler Murray. There's not a lot, there's Dak, but there's not a lot of other guys in the NFC right now who you can argue are better quarterbacks than Kirk Cousins. So I do think there's going to be a seller's market. I do think the Vikings will probably get a surprisingly competitive offers. I do think there will be multiple bidders, and I think ultimately there will probably be somebody who says, look, we'll take on the $35 million salary and we'll give you a first, and maybe we'll even give you like a day 2 pick on top of it. And if somebody gives you that kind of offer, I think you have a very, very hard time looking at the Vikings roster and saying, no, we'll extend Kirk Cousins, but thank you for the first round pick. Thank you for the offer. So I feel like ultimately that's probably where it goes. And I feel like a lot of fans, if they saw that the asking price for Kirk Cousins was a first plus and you have to take on his full contract or his full salary, they would balk at that. But I just think it's going to be a seller's market. And you've already seen the Wentz trade, the Stafford trade. Granted, those guys have more intangibles, but Kirk Cousins is also a significantly better processor, better pocket passer than those guys. So there are going to be guys, and there's always guys like McVay, Shanahan, George Payton, people out there who are like, yeah, I know Kirk Cousins, the media picks on him, but he's actually a really, really talented quarterback, and we think we can go all the way with him.
Yeah,
same reason the Vikings do.
I think that's a good point, and I think the seller's market and what the quarterback market looks like is probably the key here, right? You've got the potential for Aaron Rodgers, you've got the potential for Russell Wilson to be on the market, but those are very, I would say, unlikely circumstances at this point. It really feels like Rodgers is going to retire or stay on the Packers, or maybe he goes to the Broncos, right? But then there are 4 other places that have open quarterback spots still. And Kirk Cousins is clearly the best quarterback out of the bunch. Maybe Derek Carr, if you throw Carr into the mix, especially considering the difference in contract, right?
Yeah.
But
I think Carr stays. Like
yeah,
McDaniels kind of explicitly came in to buy in on Carr.
I agree that I think the Raiders are more bought in on Carr, and the Vikings have the flexibility to take on some of Kirk's money as well, right? Like we could choose to take an extra 10 million off of his cap hit, right? And we still save 25 million at that point trading him. So it's kind of a win-win situation, and the other team only owes him, that 25 million or whatever, which is a very reasonable price for Kirk Cousins, right? Kirk gets unreasonable when his cap hit is 35 or $45 million. He's not unreasonable when his cap hit is $25 million for a team, right? Especially for a team that's a ready-made roster that's looking to compete now, like some of those teams are. So I definitely very much agree with that point there. And, for on the Kevin O'Connell side, to me, I do think I would lean that he's looking to get rid of him a little bit more. You look at McVay going for Matthew Stafford, who is a more improvisational quarterback, right, than Kirk Cousins is. I'm not sure if he's a better quarterback, but he's definitely willing to throw the ball into triple coverage sometimes and take those risks that Kirk really is not willing to take, I think, as a guy. The Niners are moving on from Trey Lance, right? Or moving on for Jimmy Garoppolo for Trey Lance. They're moving on from that Kirk type guy. Look at the language Jay Gruden was using when Kirk was leaving Washington, right? And maybe that's a bit of sour grapes on Jay Gruden's part, but at the end of the day, right, like that was what Kevin O'Connell's been exposed to recently. So I think there might be some of a willingness to move on there. I think we've covered this situation pretty well. We'll go more in depth into the scheme on the Kevin O'Connell side once we've had more time to review it, right? Like this is a pretty new information for us, and in coming weeks, I think that's something we can delve into more deeply. Do you have any more closing thoughts on the Kevin O'Connell situation before we sign off here, Nick?
Yeah, I guess my thoughts are he was probably my second choice after Jim Harbaugh. It was him or Patrick Graham. Because I wanted a scheme guy. I feel like you look around at the elite NFL coaches and they're all scheme guys other than Tomlin, who's a player's coach. I think there are risks, and I think there are a lot of unknowns, so it's hard to form a strong opinion right now on Kevin O'Connell. I think the fact that, the biggest pros in his corner are that, one, everybody in the organization was, quote, blown away by him. And two, the fact that he was Staley's first choice as his offensive coordinator and play caller. And three, that McVay blocked him because he wanted to keep him, and it's resulted in a Super Bowl berth for the Rams this year. So there's certainly, you can certainly sell this, and it fits, like we said, the young, offensive-minded guru, the McVay clone, the analytics-friendly nerd who's going to be able to incorporate all that and bring the Vikings into the 21st century a little bit. So I see all those pluses. I have strong reservations about what the defense is going to look like if he's ready to be a head coach, if he's ready to lead the organization. We're not sure. He's not necessarily sold as a player's coach necessarily. I mean, he's clearly a very talented quarterbacks coach. All the quarterbacks he's coached with, Matthew Stafford will go to bat for him for how well he's prepared Stafford for every game. But going from a quarterbacks coach or offensive coordinator to being the head coach and being in charge of every personality in the locker room, being in charge of the culture, being in charge of the defense and the offense and everything else that's going on, is just a substantial step up in responsibility. So I'm excited to see what it all comes together as, and I do think this is a move more for the long term than the short term, and I think that's right. I think Jim Harbaugh would have been a move for the short term, and as talented as he is, I don't think this roster is necessarily ready to start pretending like they're going to contend this next year. So that the fact that they're willing to go younger. They're willing to say, we have a young GM, a young offensive mind. Let's try and figure out how we can get this roster back to how we felt back in 2015 when we were an up-and-coming team. I think that is the reason I'm most excited about this. So I can see it working out. I think how I'm ultimately going to feel about the hire will depend so much on who else is on his staff. And I'm sure they already have a plan. I bet they already have offers out there to guys. So I feel like they spent 9 hours on Monday talking to the guy. So I feel like in that 9-hour conversation, you're not just, okay, you said in our first interview you would hire Ed Donatel. Well, now let's get Ed Donatel on the phone and see if he's up for it. So I feel like they probably already have a staff in place. So it'll be interesting to see how that all comes together, because this has the potential to work out really well. It will require them finding the right coaches, the right offensive line coach, the right defensive coordinator, retaining Andre Patterson, doing a lot of other things. But it can come together and really make This is sort of like the eat your vegetables, I think, coaching candidate. I feel like it has the potential to work out well in the long term. But right now, it's not as fun or as sexy as Jim Harbaugh. But I can still, I have my reservations, and I'm not sure it's the choice I would have made, not knowing what they know, being in the room where it happened. But I can certainly get on board with it. I'm excited to see how it turns out in the upcoming days.
Yeah. So closing thoughts here too. Staff matters so much in this hire. For sure. Like who we put together on the defensive side of the ball to keep that together and not become a complete disaster matters a lot. Profiles on Kevin O'Connell there, I was trying to look some up. There's not a whole lot just in terms of like, this is who Kevin O'Connell is as a coach. This is who Kevin O'Connell is. And this is what his philosophies are. The one thing that shines through when people talk about him is communication. Right. And that was the number one trait the Vikings brought up through the search. So hearing that, not a shock to me, right? That this was ultimately the choice. And if that communication is able to work well and collaborate and bring the best ideas forward, obviously it's going to be a slam dunk, but that all remains to be seen. Right. So, here we are, we've got Kevin O'Connell and, it's pretty exciting, I think. At the end of the day, like, we can get excited about anybody. So I don't want to, say, I don't know what I'm trying to say here. Like, he is a bright offensive mind.
If Jim Harbaugh had never come along, he probably would have been most fans' favorites, I think, because he is the offensive guru. I personally really love Patrick Graham. I'm not sure people would have had the appetite for a defensive guru. I really liked, Raheem Morris had reasons to like him, but, he's kind of like a one-year wonder a little bit. Same thing with DeMeco Ryans. So the other guys who are possible, and to say nothing of the Dan Quinns or the who's the former Jets head coach, the Bucs defensive coordinator.
Todd Bowles, yeah.
Todd Bowles, compared to Todd Bowles, Kevin O'Connell's pretty attractive. So if you just think of him compared to Todd Bowles as opposed to compared to Jim Harbaugh, he'll probably feel a lot better about this hire. So
putting it way better than I could. Like you said,
just to drive the point home, there's so much we don't know about this guy. He's really, really impressive to the people he's close to. McVay obviously loves him. Staley loves him, and the Vikings front office got him in the room and were blown away. So we don't know anything about this guy. It's hard for me personally to have a strong take here. But the fact that so many people in NFL circles are really, really high on him probably says a lot more than what I could tell you right now. So I feel like you kind of look forward to finding out more about this guy and figuring out what it is exactly about this guy that has people in the NFL so excited.
Yeah, Nick Olson, putting it better than I could. Thanks for listening, everybody. We are Kindred Skols. Myself, Matt Freese, at Fries Football on Twitter. Nick, talented co-host, obviously, at Nick Olson NFL. Greg, not here with us, at You've Been Gregged. You can find Kindred Skols on Twitter, at Kindred Skols. On YouTube, just search for Kindred Skols. We're any podcast platform. You can search for us. We're pretty easy to find there. Rate us on iTunes, 5 stars only, obviously. Spotify, rate us 5 stars only.
I will take 4 stars just today. Just today, I will accept 4 stars.
No, 5 stars only.
I'm in a forgiving mood.
Don't listen to him. He's a bad influence. All right. Bye, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Bye. We love you.